200 billion marks. Not for a factory, not for a mansion or a car, for one single stale loaf of rye bread. The issue here is, a few months earlier, that same loaf cost 160 marks. So, what happened in between? Imagine Berlin, November 1923. You're rich on paper. We can technically call you a billionaire. Your arms hurt because you're pushing a heavy wooden wheelbarrow, but it's not full of groceries or something like that. It's cash, paper money stacked so high it spills onto the street. You join the bakery line. People don't talk much, they just watch the chalkboard. The baker doesn't say hello. He climbs a little ladder, grabs the chalk, and changes one number. Not once, but twice. In the 10 minutes you waited, your money aged like milk. Half its value, gone. By the time you reach the counter, the bread is still there, but your billions aren't enough. You walk away hungry, pushing a wheelbarrow full of paper that can't buy food. This isn't a dystopian movie. This was just another weekday in the Weimar Republic. But a collapse of this absolute doesn't happen by accident. To see how the world's most disciplined nation reached this point, we have to look past the ink and paper, back to a time when the debt first began to defy human logic. The true tragedy of this financial horror story didn't begin with the printing presses, but in the cold, silent halls of the Versailles Palace years earlier. When the First World War finally ended in 1918, Germany didn't just lose a war, they inherited a debt that defied human logic. The national debt stood at a staggering 156 billion marks. The Kaiser's government had made a terminal mistake. They had financed the war entirely through loans, refusing to raise taxes, because they were certain that, once they won, they would simply loot the treasuries of Paris and London to pay it back. But there was no victory. Instead, there was the London Schedule of Payments in 1921. The Allied powers presented Germany with a bill for 132 billion gold marks in reparations. It was a sum so massive it was effectively a death sentence for the German economy. Rumors began to circulate in the dark corners of the Reichstag that the government was intentionally letting the currency slide. There was a whispered, desperate strategy. If Germany could prove to the world that their economy was a smoking ruin, perhaps the Allies would stop demanding the impossible. It was a game of financial chicken played with the lives of 60 million people, and the government was about to floor the accelerator. But even this calculated risk couldn't prepare them for the spark that would set the entire system on fire. By early 1922, the German mark was already in a slow, agonizing fall. At the start of the year, $1 would buy you 320 marks. It felt expensive, but people still went to work, still saved for their children's futures, and still believed the nightmare would end. But the atmospheric pressure was dropping. The cost of living index exploded by 17 times in just 6 months. The true point of no return arrived in January 1923. Germany had fallen behind on its deliveries of timber and coal, part of the reparations. In response, French and Belgian troops marched across the border and occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial beating heart. It was a humiliation that cut to the bone. The German government, unable to resist with tanks, ordered a policy of passive resistance. They told the coal miners and steelworkers to stop working. But here was the fatal decision. The government promised to pay the wages of millions of workers while they stood idle. With no tax revenue and the factories silent, they turned to the only weapon they had left, the printing press. They began to pay for a strike with money that quite literally did not exist. And leading this charge into the abyss was a man who seemed more concerned with technicalities than the reality of a starving nation. At the center of this hurricane of paper was a man who would become the ultimate antagonist of the German economy, Rudolf Havenstein, the president of the Reichsbank. Havenstein was a man trapped in a bureaucratic trance. As the value of the mark plummeted, his solution was always the same: print more. He oversaw a logistical operation of madness. At its peak, Havenstein had 2,000 printing presses running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He contracted 300 paper mills and 150 printing companies across the country just to keep up with the demand for physical cash. By late 1923, the Reichsbank was pumping out 400 trillion marks every single day. The ink was often so fresh on the notes that they would smudge in the hands of the people receiving them. Rumors persisted that Havenstein was either completely incompetent or a man who had lost his grip on reality, obsessed with the technical necessity of supplying the public with cash, even as that very cash destroyed the public's lives. He was presiding over a system where tax revenue covered exactly 1% of the government's expenses. The other 99% was freshly printed fiction. But while Havenstein was focused on the presses, the people on the ground were dealing with a psychological breakdown that the world had never seen before. The human cost of this monetary fire was devastating. This was the era of the twice-a-day salary. Workers would be paid at 11 a.m. and again at the end of the day. Their wives would wait at the factory gates, clutching empty sacks, and the moment the cash touched their hands, they would run. They didn't walk. They sprinted to the nearest baker. If they arrived 10 minutes too late, the price of a liter of milk could have jumped by millions. In the frantic streets of 1923, stories began to circulate about a strange psychological condition the public called zero stroke. While not a formally recognized medical diagnosis in modern textbooks, contemporary reports described a form of mass hysteria where the human brain, overwhelmed by trillions and quadrillions, simply snapped. It was said that patients would spend hours scrawling endless rows of zeros on the walls, their minds unable to process a world where numbers had lost all meaning, whether a literal illness or a symbolic representation of a nation's collective nervous breakdown. The legend of zero stroke perfectly captured the mental exhaustion of the era. The concept of time itself definitely became warped. Savings that had been intended to last a lifetime, pensions for the elderly, dowries for young brides. It was liquidated into the price of a single postage stamp. But the social breakdown wasn't just about hunger. It was about who was still eating well while the country burned. While the locals were starving, a surreal world existed in the grand hotels of Berlin. This was the era of the foreigner's paradise. For those holding hard currency, Berlin became a surreal playground of excess. Legendary accounts from the time, though likely exaggerated by a resentful local press, claimed that a single US dollar could buy a life of luxury that a German worker couldn't earn in a decade. A traveler from New York could step off a train and live like a king for the price of a few loose coins. To the locals, who were watching their children grow thin, this was a living nightmare. The divide was stark. Rumors suggested that foreigners were walking into jewelry stores and buying priceless diamond necklaces, family heirlooms, for the equivalent of a few cents. This wasn't just shopping, it was a systematic asset stripping of a nation's heritage. The resentment this brewed created a dark, nationalistic rage that would eventually foster a desire for revenge against the global system. But as the foreigners enjoyed their champagne, the most vulnerable members of society were being quietly erased from existence. While the young could sometimes find ways to navigate the chaos, the elderly were being quietly offed by the economy. The backbone of German society had been the diligent, frugal saver, the person who believed in the promise of the state. In 1923, the state broke that promise in the most violent way possible. Imagine being 70 years old and finding that your monthly pension, once enough to keep a comfortable home, can no longer buy a single matchstick. This wasn't just a loss of wealth. It was a total loss of dignity. Reports from the time are filled with accounts of elderly couples who had been pillars of their communities being found in unheated apartments, having simply given up. Accusations surfaced that the government was intentionally letting the elderly fade away as a way to clear the national debt. By inflating the currency to zero, the government effectively wiped out all the money it owed to its own citizens. It was the ultimate inside job. The life's work of an entire generation was used as fuel to pay for a war they had already lost. However, while the innocent suffered, a new class of vultures was rising from the ashes of the old world. In every catastrophe, there are those who get rich. In 1923, these were the speculators. The most famous was Hugo Stinnes. Stinnes understood a dark secret of hyperinflation. If you borrow money to buy real assets, factories, mines, land, and pay the debt back later, the debt effectively disappears. While his exact share of the economy is a subject of intense historical debate, it was widely speculated at the time that his enterprise had swallowed up a massive portion of German industrial production. By borrowing trillions of marks to buy assets and then paying the debt back with worthless paper, Stinnes became the face of the man who didn't just survive the collapse, but allegedly owned the ruins. This created a profound sense of injustice. The public realized that while they were being punished for their honesty, the vultures were being rewarded for their greed. As the gap between the speculators and the people widened, the very foundations of modern civilization began to crumble, taking the country back hundreds of years. As the mark reached its final stages of worthlessness, Germany began to regress. The modern, industrial nation started to look like a village from the Middle Ages. Since money was a lie, people returned to the barter economy. Folklore from the era is filled with stories of city dwellers traveling to the countryside with grand pianos or oil paintings strapped to their cars, desperately hoping to trade their family's heritage for a sack of potatoes or a side of bacon. While these specific anecdotes may border on hyperbole, they represent the very real breakdown of trade. In the countryside, farmers became the new kings, refusing to accept paper marks and demanding real goods instead. A doctor might perform a surgery in exchange for a dozen eggs. A lawyer might write a contract in exchange for a pair of boots. This regression was the ultimate sign of the collapse of civilization. When you can no longer trust the medium of exchange, you can no longer trust your neighbor. The nation was at the absolute edge of the cliff, and it took a death and a wizard to pull it back. The fever finally broke in November 1923. Rudolf Havenstein, the man who had kept the presses running, died on the 20th. His passing felt like the symbolic end of the printing madness. In his place stepped Hjalmar Schacht, a man often called the Wizard of Finance. Schacht knew that the mark was dead beyond any hope of revival. Trust had been murdered. To fix it, he performed a psychological miracle by introducing the Rentenmark. Since Germany had no gold, he backed the currency with the land itself, a mortgage on every farm and factory in the country. It was essentially a collective agreement to believe in a new story, a piece of monopoly money backed by the soil. He exchanged the old marks for the new ones at a rate of 1 trillion to 1. Suddenly, the zeros were gone. He strictly limited the supply, and for the first time in years, the prices in the shops stopped moving. The madness was over, but the country was changed forever, and the cost of this stabilization would be paid in blood years later. The miracle of the Rentenmark saved the economy, but it couldn't save the people. The scars of 1923 became a permanent part of the German identity. The middle class never forgot the feeling of being exposed and betrayed by their own leaders. They had learned that their savings could be stolen by a printing press, and their dignity could be traded for a loaf of bread. This trauma created a void of trust that would soon be filled by a much darker force. The economic chaos provided the perfect fuel for the rise of extremist ideologies, as people who had lost everything looked for someone to blame. Even today, the German central bank remains the most inflation-averse in the world, driven by a primal fear of 1923. It serves as a haunting warning to the modern world. A currency is more than just paper and ink. It is a promise of trust between a government and its people. And once that trust is burned in the furnaces of a printing press, the darkness that follows can last for a century. Think about that next time you see a price tag change. It's not just a number, it's the heartbeat of your society.